once again, thank you all for coming. Good morning, good afternoon, time zones are a thing, and it is 10 a.m. in San Diego, and if you're in New York, it's probably lunchtime already. I'm Corey Pasiniak, the pastor of Mary Magdalene Apostle Catholic Community, who's hosting this event, and we are thrilled to have you join us from wherever you are. We've muted you, and you will not have the ability to unmute in order to sort of preserve the sound for the recording, as well as to make everyone able to hear Oliva's presentation. If you have any questions at any time, please put those in the chat. It should be on the right-hand side, or if there's a chat button at the bottom of your screen, that should bring it up. And those include questions about the presentation, technical questions, anything like that. If you need to ask permission to use the restroom, well, you don't need to ask permission. You can go and use the restroom, fetch a glass of water at any point in time. The entire presentation will be recorded, and as a result, you'll get emailed a link to the recording as soon as we get it uploaded, so probably in the next day or so, and you're welcome to share that link with others. The link that you received for today's Zoom event will be the same link for next Saturday's event as well, and we'll resend that out in case it gets lost in your email in the next week. So don't worry, you'll probably get another link next Friday to remind you, hey, you signed up for this thing, come join us again next week on Saturday morning. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a thank you to Diane Langworthy for helping to organize this event, Linda Hill Phoenix for providing harp music, and of course, Oliva Espin, who is leading our wonderful presentation today. And thank you as well to Contemplative Outreach of San Diego, Contemplative Outreach of North San Diego, and the Spiritual Directors Association of San Diego. A little background information about Oliva for those of you who don't know her. Oliva is Professor Emerita of Women's Studies at San Diego State University, having served the institution from 1990 to 2007. She's a native of Cuba, received her bachelor's degree from the Universidad de Costa Rica in 1969, and her doctoral degree from the University of Florida in 1974. After that, she worked as a psychotherapist, taught in Canada and at Boston University, and received a fellowship from the National Institute of Mental Health. In addition to her many years of teaching experience, Oliva's research and advocacy work is laudable. She's fought for refugee women to gain access to mental health services, and her articles, book chapters, and books are interdisciplinary in nature, tying in psychology, social justice issues, politics, and religion to raise questions about gender, sexuality, language, and race barriers. Her presentations in the US and the world at large have been just as exciting, if not more, than her classroom lectures. She's been a pioneer in introducing intersectional perspectives into feminist psychology. And her most recent book, Women, Sainthood, and Power, A Feminist Psychology of Cultural Constructions, is out and available for purchase if you'd like to hear more. And so without further ado, I will pass it over to Oliva.
Hello, everyone. We are going to do a mixture of poetry and discussion about John's ideas and his life and his counsel for spiritual development. As Corey said, put your questions in the chat, and in the last 15 minutes, we will answer those questions. Even if the questions are in Spanish, you can do that, no problem. And there will be a small break in between, and we will have music intervals played by Linda, as Corey said. So John basically did his teaching through his poetry. He himself said that all the books discussing the poetry were limited because poetry is really unexplainable, and the feelings presented in poetry are very difficult to describe, let alone when we are talking, as in this case, poetry written in another language and translated into English. Translated poetry really never works The Italians have a saying, traditore traduttore. The translator is a traitor. No matter how much and how good a translation is, it's always missing something. So I am going to read the poem, all poems that I'm going to read in these two presentations. First in Spanish, so you would hear the music, the rhythm, the feelings that are being conveyed in just, if you don't understand Spanish, in just the tone of the poetry. And then I will read it in English, so you will have a translation of what is being said. So I want to start with a spiritual canticle. John never called this poem the spiritual canticle. He called it songs between the soul and the bridegroom. And I'll talk more about that later. It is really a form of paraphrasing the Song of Songs. The Song of Songs was like the favorite poetry of mystics through the centuries, the biblical book of the Song of Songs. And he does one of those also. So it's, as in the Song of Songs, it's a dialogue between the soul, which is the spouse, the bride, and the bridegroom, which is God, and also a conversation with nature, asking nature and people who are out there, how do I find my beloved? How do I find God? How do I do this? So I'm going to read the poem, first in Spanish and then in English, as I said. And after the reading, we will have a short music interval by Linda. The poems were, I believe, sent to everyone who registered, so you may have the poems in front of you. But in any case, they will also be in the screen in a moment. This is a passionate love poem full of intense longing and emotion, a deep expression of love for God, the beloved of the soul. And when we read this poem, we have a sense of the urgency of the search for God that the poet is feeling. This poem has 39 stanzas. I am going to read only the first 6 because otherwise it will just be too much. So, okay. Here we go. ¿A dónde te escondiste, amado, y me dejaste con gemido? Como el ciervo huiste habiéndome herido. Salí tras ti clamando y eras ido. Pastores los que fuerdes allá por las majadas de alotero, si por ventura vierdes aquel que yo más quiero, decidle que adolezco, peno y muero. Buscando mis amores, iré por esos montes y riberas, ni cogeré las flores ni temeré las fieras, y pasaré los fuertes y fronteras. Oh bosques y espesuras, plantadas por la mano del amado, oh prado de verdura, de flores esmaltados, decid si por vosotros ha pasado. Mil gracias derramando, pasó por estos sotos con presura, y yéndolos mirando, con solo su figura, vestidos los dejó de su hermosura. Ay, ¿quién podrá sanarme? Acaba de entregarte ya de vero, no quieras enviarme de hoy más mensajero, que no saben decirme lo que quiero. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like the stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. Shepherds who go up through the sheepfolds to the hills, if by chance you see him I love most, tell him I'm sick, I suffer, and I die. Seeking my love, I will head for the mountains and for watersides. I will not gather flowers, nor fear wild beasts. I will go beyond the strong men and frontiers. O woods and thickets, planted by the hand of my beloved. O green meadow, coated bright with flowers. Tell me, has he passed by you? Pouring out 1,000 graces, he passed these groves in haste. And having looked at them, with his image alone, clothed them in beauty. Who has the power to heal me? Now, wholly surrender yourself. Do not send me any more messengers. They cannot tell me what I need to hear. Thank you, Linda.
Welcome.
So as I said, the spiritual canticle was written by John, inspired by the Song of Songs, the biblical book. It's one of the best poems ever written in Castilian Spanish. And it was written when John was in prison. I'll talk more about that later. He did not have anything to write down with, so he memorized the poem. And eventually, at the end of his prison time, he got a more compassionate jailer who gave him a little notebook and ink and pen, and he wrote the poem and took it with him when he left the prison. It's a passionate love poem, as I said. John's ability to transmit intensity of feeling in this poem and in his poetry in general comes from his use of mostly verbs and nouns and practically no adjectives or adverbs. As I said, translations never do the job well because the music and the images are lost. But despite that, even those who don't understand Spanish get the gist of his passionate poem. As in the Song of Songs, in this poem and in general in John's poetry, longing and love for God are expressed in very erotic terms. This is what is called nuptial mysticism that is present in some medieval mystics and in Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross. They're searching for union with God, and the highest stage of their search is a spiritual marriage with God. So John is supposed to be one of the best, if not the very best, according to some people. He's the best poet in Spanish language, and he's one of the authorities that the Spanish Royal Academy of the Language uses as authority for the perfection of Spanish language. So it's interesting, aside from whatever religious meaning he has. And because it is 16th century Spanish, we need to clarify some words. Some words always change meaning through the time. Languages are always in transformation. And some words he uses in very specific ways also need clarification, and that I'll do that as we go along. And then there are other peculiarities of the Spanish language. Okay, so for now, let's look at this. For John, soul equals person. He's saying the soul this, the soul that. He's really saying the person this, the person that. Now, soul is, in Spanish is el alma. Alma is a feminine grammatical gender word, and grammatical gender is arbitrary. It has nothing to do with what is feminine and what is masculine per se. It's just a question of grammar. And in fact, it's arbitrary. In Spanish, all whales are feminine. All turtles are feminine. Well, you know that all whales cannot be feminine, or else, there would never be little whales. So it has nothing to do with it. The other peculiarity of this, and this is peculiarity of Spanish, not of John, when a word starts, feminine word, start with a letter A, the article used is the masculine article, because la alma, la agua, la azúcar sound horrible. So we say el alma, el agua, el azúcar. Okay. That said, for John and for most of his contemporaries, el alma is the feminine bride referred to with feminine pronouns, even when John is referring to himself or to any man who is in love with God. So that's an interesting thing. Searching for God, God is the beloved bridegroom referred to with masculine pronouns. So John is talking about his love for God, and he's referring to himself in feminine terms because his alma, his soul, is looking for God. It's feminine. It's the bride, looking for the bridegroom. El alma, the soul, for John and his contemporaries, has an interior and an exterior part. Now, when we are thinking about psychology, and we know that some of the things that the generations past understood to be part of the soul, it's really a psychic parts. And then the interior part of the alma would be more the spirit. So el alma has an interior and an exterior part, and el alma also has faculties. And the way, again, they understood this, it's very much a tradition. That is not just John. And the alma has faculties that are memoria, entendimiento, y voluntad. Memory, understanding, and will. Those are the faculties of the soul. And John and Teresa and many of them will discuss in these terms. He had studied scholastic philosophy, which is what predominated at the time. So he's talking in terms of this scholastic philosophy. And both John and Teresa of Avila will talk about what to do with memory, with understanding, and with will, and the different ways in which these go to God or create impediments to go to God. John wrote 3 main poems: the Spiritual Canticle, the Dark Night, and the Living Flame of Love. He wrote many, many, many more poems, but we're not going to touch those because if we did that, we will have to do, I don't know how many times of seminars. So we are not going to touch on any other but these 3. And then he wrote 4 treatises or books in prose: the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night, the Spiritual Canticle, and the Living Flame of Love, in which he's explaining his poetry. The first 2, Mount Carmel and the Dark Night poem, are actually focusing on, Mount Carmel and the Dark Night treatises are both clarifying, explaining the Dark Night poem that we will deal with next session. The 2 other, the Spiritual Canticle and the Living Flame of God, referred to the respective poem by that name. It's interesting to clarify or to say 2 things. One is that John used his poems for teaching. Some of his poems he himself put into music and sang them instead of just talking them. The treatises, the explanations in writing, and what he did with these poems were addressed to women. Of course, he taught to the friars in his convent. He was master of novices and superior of the houses of the monasteries and etc. But the emphasis on the writing is that they were addressed to women who did not know theology per se, and yet they're fairly sophisticated. The explanation for the Spiritual Canticle was written for Mother Anna of Jesus, who was one of Teresa's followers and the person who brought Carmel to France. And those of you who have read Teresa of Lisieux, The Story of a Soul, she talks about Mother Anna of Jesus bringing Carmel to France. Okay, so she wrote it at the request of Mother Anna of Jesus. The Living Flame of God, he wrote as a request, at the request of a lay woman, Doña Ana de Peñalosa. And he has a number of letters written to women directees. And so it's important to know that he was trying to address women and in general people who were not particularly literate or educated in theology, and sometimes these, his writing of these treatises, it's a little bit daunting and difficult and etc. But he did not mean them to be important and complicated. On the contrary, he meant them to be simple explanations for people who were not theologians. When talking about the canticle, he writes, or when talking about his poetry, he writes in the prologue to the spiritual canticle treatise, los dichos de amor es mejor dejarlos en su anchura, para que cada uno de ellos se aproveche según su modo y caudal de espíritu, que abreviarlos a un sentido que no se acomode a todo paladar. Y así, aunque de alguna manera se declaran, no hay por qué atarse a la declaración. Those of you who speak Spanish realize that this is old Spanish that doesn't necessarily make much sense now. But in any case, what he's saying in English is, it is better to explain the utterances of love in the poetry in their broadest sense, so that each one may derive profit from them according to the mode and capacity of one's spirit, rather than narrow them down to a meaning unacceptable to every palate. As a result, though we give some explanation of these stanzas, there's no reason to be bound by my explanation. And this is something that it's near the convent where he was, the monastery where he was rector for a while in Segovia. And it's a stone that has a little saying from him, Dios es como la fuente, de la cual cada uno coge como lleva el vaso. Meaning, God is like a fountain. Each one gets from it depending on their glass. So it's a very personal interpretation. And there's his signature at the end that I'll show larger later on. Okay, some authors believe that the spiritual canticle is not for beginners, that we should start with the Dark Night and Mount Carmel and that. I think, and this is why I've chosen to start with this poem, is that when you have a sense of the prize, quote unquote, it's easier to go through the necessary nights of purgation. That it's, we will talk about those later, but it makes easier to go through whatever effort you need to put to get to God, if you know that in the end, you're going to have the sensation of intense love. And if we read the 39 stanzas of this poem, which will take forever, so I'm not going to do it, we will see that progressively this search that the bride is doing lends itself to an embrace with the beloved. So I'm going to start in a moment talking about John as a person and important cultural and context and points of his life. I want to first, though, go back to the poem once again, and we will have a brief break immediately after and then we'll come back for talking about John and his life. So let me read this again for you, followed by, again, some playing from Linda, and just let the poem percolate through you in whichever way. Use whatever kind of glass you have in order to get from the water of God that you can get from this poem for yourself. And maybe one word, one stanza, one thought, it's more meaningful for you than the other. Stay with that and sort of make it yours. And try to keep silent during the break, if that's possible, so you can sort of take this in as you're hearing Linda's music. And at the end of Linda's music, we will go back. But if you want to turn off and go to the bathroom or drink a glass of water or do whatever, after I read the poem and Linda starts playing, that is perfectly fine. Okay. ¿A dónde te escondiste, amado, y me dejaste con gemido? Como el ciervo huiste habiéndome herido, salí tras ti clamando y eras ido. Pastores los que fuerdes allá por las majadas al otero, si por ventura vierdes aquel que yo más quiero, decidle que adolezco, peno y muero. Buscando mis amores, iré por esos montes y riberas, ni cogeré las flores, ni temeré las fieras, pasaré los fuentes y fronteras. O bosques y espesuras, plantadas por la mano del amado, o prado de verduras, de flores esmaltado, decid si por vosotros ha pasado. Mil gracias derramando, pasó por estos sotos con presura, y yéndolos mirando, con solo su figura, vestidos los dejó de su hermosura. Ay, ¿quién podrá sanarme? Acaba de entregarte ya de vero, no quieras enviarme de hoy más mensajero, que no saben decirme lo que quiero. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like the stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. Shepherds, you who go up through the sheepfolds to the hill, if by chance you see him I love most, tell him I am sick, I suffer, and I die. Seeking my love, I head for the mountains. I head for the mountains and for water sides. I will not gather flowers, nor fear wild beasts. I will go beyond strong men and frontiers. O woods and thickets, planted by the hand of my beloved, O green meadow, coated bright with flowers, tell me, has he passed by you? Pouring out 1,000 graces, he passed these groves in haste, and having looked at them, with his image alone, clothed them in beauty. Who has the power to hear me? Now wholly surrender yourself. Do not send me any more messengers. They cannot tell me what I need to hear. Okay, let's take a deep breath and come back from break. So in order to understand John better, let's talk about the context in which he lived and the story of his own life. And the slide you're seeing now, it's a statue of John that is sort of across from, diagonally across from the sanctuary of Saint Teresa, which is in the home where Teresa was born. And as you can see on the wall, there's one of the stanzas of the poem. Mil gracias derramando paso por estos sotos con presura y yéndolos mirando con solo su figura, vestido los dejó de su hermosura. Pouring out 1,000 graces, he passed these groves in haste, and having looked at them with his image alone, clothed them in beauty. So this is a photograph of that place, and it's a wide area, so it's an interesting place in Avila. Okay, so let's go to John's life. He was born in 1542 from his father was from a merchant family that was reasonably accommodated. His mother was from Morisco ancestry. Morisco meant Moor in Spain, you know, the Muslims who conquered and dominated Spain for more than 800 years were known as Moors, and still they're talked about as Moors. So he was of Morisco descent. If you remember the first screen of our slideshow, the invitation for the program, this icon by Robert Lenz of John has writing in Arabic in the back to sort of talk about the fact that he had Arabic ancestry. Although these people, these Moors, were Muslim, they were fully Spaniards. I mean, if you are in a place for 100 years, obviously you belong to that place. And they, in fact, have left their impact in Spain. They created a whole civilization. They were kingdoms. They were not just immigrants or people who live in a place. They had their own big kingdoms, and some of their significant contributions to knowledge in mathematics and astronomy that Muslims are known for in the early Middle Ages came from Spain. They left behind beautiful architecture, the Alhambra, the mosque in Cordoba, music, certainly a mark in Spanish DNA. And the language, the Spanish language, is full of Arab words. Sala, aceite, any word that starts with AL. And inshallah in Spanish is ojalá. So we do have a very serious influence of Arabic in our language. And just speaking of DNA, sort of as an aside, when I did my own DNA, it had a high proportion, of course, of Spanish ancestry, but also a reasonably high proportion of North African ancestry, which means somehow, someplace, I have Arab blood and also Jewish blood. So that's another story. Anyway, so Christians fought for centuries to expel the Moors from Spain. And again, we're talking about dominating kingdoms. We're not talking about immigrants in this case. Finally, the Catholic monarchs, Isabella and Ferdinand, called Los Reyes Católicos, okay, succeeded in January 1492 to defeat the last bastion of the Moors in Granada. They followed by with the expulsion of Jews in March, and then Columbus came to the Indies in August. So 1492. But something interesting is that even though they expelled the kingdom of the Moors, they did not expel the Moors, who were, as I said, Spaniards who came from this descent. The Moors, the Moriscos, were not forced to convert to Christianity until 1502. And those who did not convert, who continue practicing Islam, were expelled in 1609. So more than a century after the Jews were expelled and after the Moors as a kingdom or as dominators had been expelled. So the Moorish population left behind when the kingdom of Spain, the Moorish kingdoms of Spain were finally defeated, the kingdom of Granada was finally defeated, tended to be poor people. So that may be one reason why they decided, you know, the Spanish government decided not to bother with this Moors, because they didn't have really anything. The Jews were another story. The Jews had been very influential in the Christian kingdoms of Spain. One of the main advisors for Queen Isabella was a Jewish man. So the Jews did not have a political area that they dominated, but they were very influential politically inside Christian Spain. So they were perceived as being more dangerous because they were sort of in all parts of society in a way that poor Moorish people never had that kind of influence. And the other thing, again, they didn't have much money, and many Jews have enough money that you could take away from them. So that was a reason for the difference between the treatment of both populations. Some authors believed that there's Islamic, particularly Sufi influence on John's poetry. And that doesn't necessarily have to do with his ancestry. It was all around in Spanish culture. So he did it. It's nothing that came directly from his ancestry, but more something that was diffused in cultural influences in Spanish, particularly in the region of Andalusia, where John lives for a big chunk of his life. Okay, back to his family. His father was Gonzalo de Yepes. And as I said, his family was middle class and Christian. But they disinherited him when he married Catalina Alvarez, John's mother, who was of Moorish ancestry. So suddenly his parents, certainly his father, who had lived a middle class family, had no money at all. And they had to just start working with their hands. So they lived in poverty. They worked as weavers to earn a living. And so John's initial name was Juan de Yepes, Y-E-P-E-S. He had two older brothers, Francisco, who was his lifelong friend, and Luis. And his father, John's father, died when John was very young, and Luis, the middle brother, died shortly after the father, apparently of severe malnutrition. John himself was seriously malnourished. He was under 5 feet tall and very thin when he was an adult. Teresa of Avila, in fact, described him as half a friar. She says she now had 1 friar and a half to start a monastery, referring to John and the other friar who started the first monastery of the Carmelite reform. So, you know, childhood malnutrition shows itself in the height and weight of adults in all cultures at all times, even today. Just as an aside, the generation that grew up in Cuba in the 1990s is thinner and shorter than previous and post generations from that period after the fall of the Soviet Union, when lots of people in Cuba were very malnourished. Okay, so John was born in Fontiveros, that's the name of the town, in 1542. After his father's death, his mother struggled to support children, and after losing one of the children, she moved to another town, Medina del Campo, where there was more of a market and more movement. So John lived most of his childhood in Medina del Campo. In early adolescence, he started working at the plague hospital, where mostly people with syphilis and other venereal diseases and contagious diseases were treated. He earned a little money there and begged. In other words, he grew up really poor, as in Spanish, the Spaniards say, pobre de solemnidad. He did not choose to be poor out of virtue. He knew what it was to be really poor and not have an alternative but to work or beg for your food. You know, we admire St. Francis for being a rich boy who decided to opt for poverty, or even Teresa of Avila and many others who came from middle-class families and decided to live in poverty. John did not choose poverty. I mean, eventually he chose it, but he had a direct understanding of the meaning of real experience of poverty and sickness at a very early age. Richard Rohr, for example, talks about Franciscan poverty, and yes, I don't have my own personal property, but I have everything I need. In the case of John, he did not have anything he needed, and neither did his family. So that is why his poetry, his writing, his behaviors, his opinions are characterized by humility, lack of ostentation of any kind, emotional nakedness, if you wish. So the director of this hospital where John was working as a young adolescent, taking care of sick people, was very impressed with him and sent him to the Jesuit school. The Jesuits had just been founded, and he sent them to the Jesuit school and offered him a position as chaplain of the hospital if he went to seminary. The position of chaplain carried money. John decided he did not want this position, and instead he entered the Carmelite Order and took the name of Fray Juan de San Matias. He was ordained a priest in 1567, and shortly after that met Teresa of Avila, who was in the process of creating convents for women, and I'll say a little bit more about the Carmelites in a moment. She was in the process of creating convents for women and wanted to start also convents for men of her reformed of the Carmelite Order. And so John and another friar, Fray Antonio de Jesus, became the first 2 friars who started the first male reformed convent of Carmelites. In 1572, he became the confessor at the Incarnation, which is the convent that Teresa had started from and had become prioress of after a number of years. At the end of 1577, he was kidnapped from the Incarnation and arrested by the Carmelites, by the Carmelites who were not reformed, and taken to a prison in Toledo. And he was kept in that prison in miserable conditions until 1578, when he escaped from prison. And something interesting is that he's talking about this passive letting God work in your soul and just a quiet life, a silent life, a solitary life. At the same time, he was actually very active at doing things when things needed doing. He escaped from prison. He spent weeks disassembling the screws at the edge of the hinges of the door of his prison. He took the rag that had given him for a blanket. He cut it in strips with his hands, tied them together, hid it, and when it was time to leave, he just moved the door aside that did not have hinges anymore and hung himself with the use of these cords down a very dangerous precipice. So he was very active when it needed to be. And in fact, from 1579 to 1590, he spent his time involved in founding convents, being a superior, doing spiritual director, etc. At the end of 1590, there was a serious dispute inside the Discals, inside the Reformed Carmelites, and he was removed from his positions. And he died the following year in the convent in Úbeda. When he was in the Jesuit school and then later at the University of Salamanca, in addition to theology and humanities, he studied art. So he made a number of sculptures in wood that have not been preserved and a number of other drawings and paintings. The one that has survived is the drawing to the left, which is a drawing of Jesus on the cross that supposedly it's something he saw when he was at some time praying in a high choir in a chapter and saw Jesus below him in this position. The painting on the right is the interpretation of the Christ of St. John of the Cross, painted by Salvador Dali, famous Salvador Dali. And the title of that painting is the cross, the Christ of St. John of the Cross, El Cristo de San Juan de la Cruz. It is now in Scotland in a museum. I saw it when it was exhibited for the first time in the Spanish Pavilion in 1958 at the World Exposition in Brussels. It's an enormous painting and very impressive. The one John did is a very small reliquary. That's why it has that round form, because they cut the paper, the nuns, and put it in this form. So before I get into the Carmelites and the Teresian Carmelite reform, let me say a few things about differences between the situation of Teresa and the nuns and the situation of John and the priests. Teresa was 52 when she met John. John was 25. And at that time is when he changed his name to Juan de la Cruz, and he signed, I have it here, here it is, here's his signature. This is his real signature. Fray Juan de la Cruz. There's a cross, see? So he didn't write the word cross, he just drew a cross. try one of the cross. That was his signature. Okay, so the difference in education between them reflects differences between the lives of men and the lives of women. John, as I said, was a starving poor, grew up in a very poor family, but he was a man. And other men took interest in him and facilitated his education. He was expected to teach and provide sacraments to others. Teresa was a woman. She could not get a formal education. She could not read Latin, which is where the serious things were written at the time. Teresa self-educated by reading from her father's family and other books she found. And she was a writer of books full of her own personal experiences. In doing her own personal experiences, actually providing a very theological understanding about spiritual development. John wrote, explaining his poetry using theological and philosophical perspectives and biblical concepts. It was okay for him to do it while she was persecuted for doing it. The Inquisition never did anything against John, contrary to some modern translators of John who mentioned the Inquisition. He never had trouble with the Inquisition. Teresa did. Teresa was never condemned, but was investigated by the Inquisition because a woman is not supposed to be writing and teaching. There was never any question that John had the right to do it. Teresa spends her writing apologizing for daring to write and saying that letrados, men with letters, knowledgeable men can judge if what she's saying is correct. John never went into that. And considering the difference in social background, we see that male privilege sort of took precedence over what was going on in terms of social class background. Okay. So, later in life, all his life, when John held important positions within the Carmelites, he never forgot his family, in this case, his mother and brother, or where he can come from. And any time that somebody wanted to say, oh, Reverend Father, you are so important, he said, no, I'm not. I came from a family of poor weavers. Okay, let's talk about the Carmelites, because I've been talking about the Carmelites and reform and all that, and we need to sort of get that, and I have to rush because time is running fast. Okay, so the Carmelite order feels connected to the prophet Elijah from the Hebrew Bible. According to their tradition, around the time of the Crusades, a few hermits, male hermits, lived in caves around Mount Carmel in what today is Haifa. And Mount Carmel is, of course, in the Bible, very identified with the prophet Elijah. And it's the sanctuary of Our Lady of Mount Carmel is still now in Haifa. And I'm still looking for a picture of that. I tried to find that yesterday, I couldn't. Okay, so supposedly these hermits who were living in caves in Mount Carmel were praying in solitude, each one of them in his cave, fasting, and every so often they got together to pray. At some point, they received a strict rule of life from Saint Albert, the Patriarch of Jerusalem. Eventually, when the Muslims recovered the area of Mount Carmel from the Crusaders, the hermits were forced to move to Europe, where they joined the other mendicant orders that had been found around that time, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and also the Augustinians. Mendicant means that these orders, Franciscans, Dominicans, etc., Carmelites, lived off money donated to them, rather than off large tracts of land that Benedictine monasteries in the variety of rules, Cistercians, Carthusians, etc., owned. So these orders were a new phenomenon in Europe in the Middle Ages because they needed donors. And sometimes donors gave them a house. It's not that what they gave were little pieces of money here and there. Sometimes they got big gifts, but still they depended on what other people gave them. That's what they are called mendicants, or what they were paid for performing liturgies or whatever it may be. Okay. So even though the Carmelites initially tried to keep the charisma of mostly playing in solitude and working with their hands, they slowly became more and more with preaching, living in cities, and living in larger groups together. Then they received what was called a mitigated rule and lived like any other priest or lay religion in Europe. At some point in there, they founded an order of nuns, to which Teresa of Avila eventually, a century or so after, eventually became. And the mitigated rule lead to more and more laxity. At the time of Teresa's life in the convent of the Incarnation, more than 100 nuns lived there. Some even had inside the convent small apartments where they had servants who cooked for them, while nuns who came from poor families lived in dormitories and had little to eat. The locutory, where nuns received visitors, was always full of fun activities, friends, and men. Teresa talks about that. Some nuns went home regularly, visited relatives, visited friends, went here and there, so there was little time for solitude and prayer. Just the obligatory prayers in community were required of us. Despite that, Teresa started stealing times away for prayer, and in conversation with other nuns and friends, decided to start a reform where the primitive rule, the rule of Saint Albert, the more demanding rule, would be followed by others. So she decided to start a reform of the other. And there were a number of reforms of different orders happening in Europe at the same time. The most intense, or the best known, is the one by Teresa. And we cannot confuse the reform. When we talk about the reform, referring to the Carmelites, it has nothing to do with the Protestant Reformation in the world. I mean, it had to do in the sense that at some level it was a reaction to the Protestant Reformation, to try to reform Catholicism, what was called the Counter-Reformation, to make Catholicism go back to the origins of Christianity. To have a more pure version of Christianity. So Teresa started the reform of the Carmelites, and after creating a first convent in Avila for reformed Carmelites, she received permission to create other reformed convents for both and men, for women and men. When she met John after his ordination, she asked him to help him and Fray Antonio to start the reform of the male Carmelites. The reformed Carmelites were known as descalzos, shoeless, because they went barefoot or used a type of food used in Spain called alpargatas that are made of rope and cloth and used despite cold and rain when your feet get cold and wet. The Carmelites who did not want to join the reform were known and continue to be known at that time, in any case, as cals, meaning they use shoes. The Carmelites, females and males, who did not want to participate in the reform, which meant to be subjected to a stricter rule, rebelled violently. A long struggle between the cals and the discals followed, and for many years it came and went, with bishops and papal envoys favoring one or the other group, until the Pope finally separated the two groups into different orders, which persist until today, although today they collaborate together a lot more. The two groups are still distinguished by the designation letters after their name. The old on reform Carmelites sign after the name O. Carm, while the Discalced Carmelites after the name use OCD, Order Carmelitas Descalzos. Okay. So in the middle of this struggle about the reform and what was going to happen and etc., John was kidnapped and imprisoned in Toledo by the Calced Carmelites and subjected to cruel privations and physical torture. He got whipped at least once a week, if not more frequently. In his very small cell that was more a closet than a cell, with only a little window on top where light and air came from, he had nothing but a breviary, which is what the priest used to say, the office of the hours. He was never allowed to wash for almost a year. He was served bread, water, and sardines. He had a bucket that served as a toilet, a little bench, and a bunch of straw and raggy blankets for bed. It was in this context that he composed the spiritual canticle that we have been hearing and going through, and several of his other poems. He did not write The Dark Night in prison. Lots of people say he did. No, he didn't. He wrote it after, a few years later. So what he wrote in the middle of this horrible moment was a beautiful poem of love to God. The Dark Night came later, which is also another beautiful poem of love for God. We'll talk about that Dark Night next time. So, as I said, his second jailer was a little bit more compassionate and found him paper, pen, and ink, and sort of turned a blind eye when he was constructing a rope and disengaging the hinges of his cell door. It is, and he actually, this second jailer eventually got punished for letting John escape, but okay. So again, it's important to reiterate that his imprisonment was not by the Inquisition, but by fellow Carmelites who did not want to be reformed. It's, you know, I am very impressed with the fact that that beautiful poem and other beautiful poems, I mean, the other things he composed in there were absolutely beautiful. At the time when the only option he had was to memorize his own poetry because he couldn't even write it. Okay, after he escaped and, you know, first he went to a convent of nuns and the nuns sent him to a hospital and etc. Anyway, after he escaped, he started becoming involved with the order in a more, so fulfilling more important positions. This is a painting of John that is preserved in the convent where he died in 1591. Is it a true portrait of him? We don't know, because there are a number of paintings of him that don't really look, you know, the same, but it's an interesting, okay. So it's an interesting portrait of him that, okay. So before we go back to the spiritual canticle, and I'm going to say more about John's doctrine when we talk about the Dark Night and etc. next time. But it's important to look how John's and Teresa's were actually sending a very revolutionary message. His interpretation and Teresa's interpretation of Christianity and search for God have a profound political and revolutionary message, in contrast with the emphasis on honor and prestige of the Spain of their time. The attractiveness of John's writing to nuns and lay people has a lot to do with his simplicity, his drawing, his songs. And after he became a superior, and you could say an important cleric, he still tended the garden, laid brick for buildings, worked on wood. He could have delegated a lot of his work, but he didn't. During his years as a Carmelite superior, he traveled more than 20,000 miles, all of them on foot, and sometimes on a donkey. In the middle of all his responsibilities, he continued a deep practice of solitude. Walking on a dirt road in alpargatas, tending the garden, building convent walls with his hands, drawing, writing, or whatever, he managed to be inside himself and in the presence of God, in dialogue with his beloved. So his spirituality is not about floating in spiritual bliss, but about a very concrete, down-to-earth life full of activity, and yet preserving the internal space for a relationship with God. The willingness to lose everything, to give everything in himself away to others, is an expression of this internal space of love. In many ways, some of his comments about detachment, that again we will talk more about next time, are grounded in this interiority, but they are also grounded in his concrete experience of real poverty. Despite being educated at the prestigious University of Salamanca, which was one of the best in Europe, his letters of spiritual direction are simple, kind, loving, and sent to lay women, nuns, poor guys, etc. While Teresa writes as if he's in awe of letrados, and you know, it's a strategy, so her writings are accepted, but still, that's how she writes. John brings letrados, lettered men, men who know, down, including himself, you know, making fun of himself and saying, I'm not so great. Some authors who write about John think that his class consciousness experience was present behind his gentleness as a confessor and spiritual director. Those who are poor, ignorant, including women, deserve attention because God might be working more actively in them than in some people who believe themselves superior in education, in class, or in honor. So I would like to end before we go to the questions with another moment of listening to the first stanzas of the spiritual canticle. And again, I know this is a repetition, but forms of centering prayer, Christian meditation, Buddhist meditation, Lectio Divina, and just from simple everyday prayer, including the rosary, repetition helps us get behind the meaning and to get into the meaning of us, for us, of words and texts. It's that glass that you yourself, whatever your capacity, bring to the fountain who is God and receive thus however much water, however much God, and in whichever shape your container is. And by saying these things over and over, we sort of get into them and make them ours. Remember that John believed this was a very personal process in which each person may derive profit from these words according to the mode and capacity of one spirit. So let's go to the next reading thinking, what, if anything, do you want to say to God in poetry or in prose? Doesn't matter, whatever comes up. What John's words may be saying to you. What God is saying to you today. And after we do this, and a very short interval of music this time, because we don't really have much time, we'll go to questions. Okay, so once again. ¿A dónde te escondiste, amado, y me dejaste con gemido? Como el ciervo huiste habiéndome herido, salí tras ti clamando y eras ido. Pastores los que fuerdes allá por las majadas aloteros, y por ventura vierdes aquel que yo más quiero, decirle que adolezco, peno y muero. Buscando mis amores, iré por esos montes y riberas, ni cogeré las flores, ni temeré las fieras, y pasaré los fuertes y fronteras. Oh bosques y espesuras, plantadas por la mano del amado, oh prado de verduras, de flores esmaltado, decid si por vosotros ha pasado. Mil gracias derramando, pasó por estos sotos con presura, y yéndolos mirando, con solo su figura, vestidos los dejó de su hermosura. Ay, ¿quién podrá sanarme? Acaba de entregarte ya de vero, no quieras enviarme de hoy más mensajero, que no saben decirme lo que quiero. Where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like the stag after wounding me. I went out calling you, but you were gone. Shepherds, you who go up the sheepfolds to the hill, if by chance you see him I love most, tell him I am sick, I suffer, and I die. Seeking my love, I will head for the mountains and for watersides. I will gather flowers, nor fear wild beasts. I will go beyond strong men and frontiers. O woods and thickets, planted by the hand of my beloved, O green meadow, coated bright with flowers, tell me, has he passed by you? Pouring out 1,000 graces, he passed these groves in haste, and having looked at them, with his image alone, clothed them in beauty. Ah, who has the power to hear me? Now, wholly surrender yourself. Do not send me any more messengers. They cannot tell me what I need to hear. Okay, let's come back. Breathe. And let's start seeing if you have any questions for this. And as I said, next time we'll do the dark night and the living flame of love. So
our first question is refers to a quote that's in a Thomas Keating book that's attributed to John of the Cross, and the quote is, "God the Father spoke only one word from all eternity. He spoke it in eternal silence, and it is only in silence that we hear it." And someone asked that you comment on that quote.
yes, it's what he said. Basically, it's a longer text, but what he says is that when God needed to speak a word, that word was the Logo made flesh. That word was Christ. And if we want to know what God has to say, we have to look at the life of Christ, because that is what God is saying. Who Jesus was and how he lived and how he died and what he preached, and also, who he was, is what God is saying. That is the word of God. And so rather than going into elaborate what God may be meaning or saying, what we need to do is go to the life of Christ. And again, it's the same thing that Teresa says. We have to look at the humanity of Jesus. We have to look at this person and know that this is what God is telling us. And then create a friendship with that person and develop our life of prayer. And of course, all of that is done in silence and listening and taking in that, Jesus' life and the gospel and etc.
So we also had someone wondering whether the prison cell that John on the Cross was in still exists and whether one could visit it, if you know the answer.
I believe that monastery was destroyed. I'll check that for next time. One of the things I looked at and might actually put up for on the PowerPoint for next time, it's some views of Toledo back there and then and now. Because Toledo, for those of you who have not been there, it's like a hill that it's surrounded on three sides by the Tagus River, by El Tajo. And so it's a beautiful place. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. But I think that monastery has disappeared.
We also had someone who missed what you said at the beginning about what was John's original name for the spiritual canticle.
Songs of the Bride and the Bridegroom. Canciones entre el alma y el esposo.
Thank you. And most of the other questions were answered in the course of your presentation. They were about why he was arrested and that which you went on to answer. So at this point, we have about a little over 10 minutes left. And so if people have additional questions, you should have the ability to unmute yourself and ask those questions of Oliva if you would like.
Okay. I'm going to gallery view to see people better. So unmute and ask.
Yes, I have a question. Was the poetic form in which Juan wrote a common form? I was looking at the rhyme scheme and the meter. Was that a popular poetic form at that time, or did he invent that and have poets used it since?
Other poets were using similar types of things. The rhyme is in Spanish, and when you're in school, I think I said we studied John as a poet in literature class when I was in high school. I don't know if I said it. Anyway, you study rhyme and how to make a poem rhyme and how do you construct syllables in poems and that kind of thing. That's part of the sort of the training. And so we had that, and he had that. There were other poets like Quevedo and Góngora and etc. who were sort of known at the time who were doing this. What he does that it's very unique contribution is that he does not use adjectives or adverbs. And if he does, it's minimal. If you look at the poem again, it's all nouns and particularly verbs, which is what it gives it the sense that you're going after something, that you're moving, that you're searching for something. So that is what makes his poetry sort of so active. I don't know how else to say it, but so active. And that is uniquely his. And one of the reasons he was put in by the language, Spanish Royal Academy of the Language as one of the models of writing is his skill conveying this activity in what he's doing.
Thank you.
Oliva?
Yes.
Yes, you may have already addressed this, but was the Castilian Spanish spoken throughout Spain during that period, or remind me, I forget what you
No, Castilian Spanish, which is what we now call Spanish, Español.
Mm-hmm.
Castilian Spanish became more powerful because Castile was the most powerful of the kingdoms inside of what was Spain.
Mm-hmm.
But in Aragon and in Catalonia, they spoke Catalonian. They speak it to this day.
Oh.
In the north, they spoke Galician. So they're other, and this Basque, of course. So they're, you know, those other languages in Spain. That's why I kept saying Castilian Spanish rather than just saying Spanish,
Mm-hmm.
because it's Castellano.
Okay.
Right.
Right.
And of course, it became extended in such a way because Castile was the most powerful kingdom that everyone in Spain to this day has to study Castellano, has to study Castilian, has to learn Castilian and speak in Castilian, and all the official documents are in Castilian, even if in your region, in your home, etc., you speak Catalonian or Basque or Galician or whatever. And they, as you know, I'm sure you read the newspapers, there have been lots of fights about the right to use these other languages and independence for other pieces of the country that speak their languages, because initially they were separate countries. They were separate kingdoms. So, yeah.
Okay. So he spoke and wrote in the Castilian because of the area he was in?
Yes, he was Castilian. He and Teresa were both born and lived all their lives in Castile. And in fact, he was prior in Andalusia in a number of monasteries in southern Spain, and he was never completely happy there. He actually was, you know, he was there because he had to be there, but he kept wanting to go back to Castile.
Thank you.
Because there were very clear differences. Andalusia spoke Castilian because what they spoke before was Arabic. And after they were conquered, Castilian was the language that was there. But they have, again, if you've been to Spain and you speak Spanish, the particular accent of Andalusians is very different from how the Castilians speak the language. So there's still very marked differences, even centuries later.
Great, great.
Olivia,
Gracias.
was,
Olivia?
what I was just wanted to ask, was John's poetry read during his lifetime? How far was it published? I mean, this would have been read, I guess, by the
Yeah.
educated class, or
Yeah, his poetry as poetry was published for the first time in 1628, so a number of years. He died in 1591, so a few years it was published. But he used it verbally, and as I said, he put some of his poems to song, to music. So he used it to teach a lot. And he had memorized his poetry, and other people memorized his poetry. And, you know, it was a way of, you know, repeating something that helped you pray, because, you know, his poems are a form of prayer. Then for a while, you know, so at the beginning, a few years after his death, as I said, it was published, etc. And then slowly his fame sort of dissipated. He was canonized. Teresa was canonized about 40 years after her death. He was canonized more than a century after his death. And then sometime at the beginning of the 19th century, or in the middle of the 19th century, his poetry started becoming slowly more known. And some of the big linguists of Spain at the end of the 19th century used his verses as models for how to write. And so he started becoming more and more popular. And in the 20th century, he has become very popular among people who meditate. Their workshops organized about Buddhist meditation and John of the Cross meditation, and a lot of things of that sort. So he has become very popular, sometimes a bit too popular, because there are lots of distortion of what he said. So anyway, including his famous phrase, dark night, that has nothing to do with having a hard time. And it's bantered around, oh, I'm having the dark night of the soul because I'm sick. No, it's not that. I'll talk more about that next. Okay, Sharon, I think you raised your hand.
Yes, I had a question. I had a question about his death, and I was looking at what you had put up on the screen about his life. And at his death, he was removed from many of his positions. There was some kind of dispute. Now, maybe you're going to talk about that next week. I don't know.
He was in 1590. He was removed. There was one of the chapters, you know, the order met every so often, the whole order. And he had been one of the 3 superior generals of the order for a while, and aside from being superior of specific houses, etc. At that particular chapter, he was removed because the main superior was a very authoritarian man. And John was very mild, and it was, okay, whatever you say, you know, that kind of thing. And this guy did not want John around. I mean, it's interesting that something that was born out of reform movement to become more spiritual ended up also being full of disputes. In the male order, interestingly, not so much in the female order, but in the males, you know, were the ones who were quarreling about who knows more and has more authority here and whatever. Okay. So he was removed from all his positions. And at that particular moment, he actually applied to be sent to Mexico, you know, with whatever. That's the part of colonization. Well, that's a different story, but okay. So he had applied for that. And then he got gangrene in one of his legs. We don't know. I mean, he may have been diabetic. We don't know that. He may have, whatever happened. a wound he had on one of his legs became infected, and he developed gangrene and started getting sicker and sicker. So he moved to the monastery in Ubeda, who was a poor place where he could just stay. And the prior in Ubeda was actually very angry to have this guy who had been so important there, because this monastery was poor and he's gonna have to be paying for a doctor for John of the Cross. So he was very annoyed that John was even there. Eventually, the prior who had started the male Reformed Carmelite, Fray Antonio de Jesus, came, and at that time, Fray Antonio was a provincial, so he had an important position. And he got very angry with the prior and said, how are you treating this man this way, and etc., and sort of righted the wrong. And what John did was ask the prior of that convent in Ubeda to forgive him for making him have so many expenses because he had come while he was sick. And then the prior sort of melted and thought, oh my God, how could I have been so mean, and etc. But so he moved to this convent because he was sick after being removed from his positions. And there was a very short period of time between being removed and his death. He may have been reinstated in the next chapter. We don't know that.
So
another question.
It is noon, so I'm aware of the time, but we have, I think, 2 more questions, one from Victoria and one from Cheryl. So Oliva, if you have still a few moments.
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, so Cheryl asks that you spoke of John's simplicity and challenging those who felt superior based on education and income and economic status. Did he speak to patriarchy or superiority assumptions about gender, or was that not discussed in that era by John and his contemporaries?
He didn't talk about that. It was assumed by everybody that men were more intelligent and superior. In fact, Teresa, who was a very bright woman, her whole writing is full of, oh, I'm an ignorant little woman and I don't know what I'm saying, you know. So that was sort of the attitude of the time. But in actual practice, because he was mostly confessors of nuns in the Incarnation, in Beas, in Granada, because he wrote for women, his letters of spiritual direction are basically written for women. So he didn't talk about it, he didn't challenge the concepts as such, but in his practice, he was saying women are as good as men and they can really reach God. And that's why I'm writing for them and being their spiritual director and helping them grow and etc. So in practice, he was very much for equality, if you wish. That, you know, that's something that was very present for him. What's the other question, Corey?
Victoria, I think you had a question.
Yes. Can you hear me? I'm having trouble with my computer.
Yes, I can hear.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious because I'm a musician. If that we have the music that John used for his poetry, did he ever write it down, or did someone else write it down when they heard it?
I don't believe so. In fact, we do not have anything in John's actual handwriting except for his signature in documents, because the originals pretty much disappeared. You know, things deteriorate, paper deteriorates. That's why his wood sculptures all deteriorated and we don't have any of them. They are being copied by they were copied by one of his close secretaries. His name was Juan Evangelista. And so what we have is the copies made for Juan Evangelista of John's writings. We do not have the originals. And no, as far as I know, we don't have the music. And by the way, going to the previous question, one of the things that was used to take him away from his position is that another priest by the name of Diego Evangelista, I mean, they're talking about the gospel, but didn't seem to believe in the gospel too much. This particular guy, anyway, tried to say that John had too many relationships with women, that he confessed too many women and wrote too many letters to women, and probably he was doing something wrong while he was doing that. And in fact, many of his letters were destroyed by his women directees because he spoke with them with love, with kindness, with gentleness. And if they fell in the hands of this Diego Evangelista and his cronies, the idea that he had inappropriate relationships with women directives could have taken hold. So, you know. Okay,
All right.
I
Well,
think we are done for today.
I think so. So thank you. A huge thank you to Oliva for leading us in this wonderful presentation. Again, to Linda Hill Phoenix for the harp music, and to all of our attendees for joining us for this time together. We'll be back same time next week. We will send you an email with the recording to this week's presentation, as well as send you out the Zoom link again. So thank you. Peace be with you, and have a good week all.
See you all next week, and keep John's thoughts with you.
Thank
Gracias.
you. Yes, we will.
Thank you, Oliva.
Thank you, Oliva.
Thank you, Oliva.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Oliva.
Thank you.
Bye.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Great way to
Thank
start a
you to
Saturday.
all of you for being here.
Bye.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being here.
Great job.